Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. I am very excited and honored to have Lynne McTaggart on the program today. And Lynne is a really special voice in this science of consciousness and understanding the effects of consciousness and tension that it has on the body, on the population at large, this sort of integration that the human mind has with the greater mind, if you will, and is the author of many best-selling books, including The Field, The Intention Experiment, The Bond, and her latest book, which we'll be talking a lot about, The Power of Eight. Thank you, Lynne, for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to sort of use the initial part of our conversation just to as a way to introduce yourself to the listeners. It seems like, as I've read through your books over the last couple of weeks, that there is one giant motif that is kind of threaded through all of these books, and that your investigation and your journey going from your first one all the way up to where you are now would be a great way to kick this conversation off. So is that something that you can do?
Sure. I guess most people don't realize that I started out life as an investigative reporter. My early work in my 20s was having a hidden tape recorder on me and breaking baby selling rings, cracking baby selling rings around the world and posing as an unwed mother and a variety of things like that. So it's a big change doing that and moving into consciousness research, but it was a logical journey. In the next decade, I started with my husband a newsletter called What Doctors Don't Tell You, to look at what works and what doesn't work in conventional and alternative medicine. And because of our very fact-based approach, we were studying medical literature all the time. And I kept coming across very good studies of things like spiritual healing. And I kept wondering to myself, wait a minute, if you can have a thought and send it to someone else and make them better, that in itself completely undermines the way the world works. So I decided to try to find out why. And so I persuaded my publishers to let me go on a journey, and I truly did not have a compass. I had no idea where I was going. But I thought I'll talk to a lot of scientists involved in consciousness research who can explain this to me. Maybe there's such a thing as human energy fields. So I started talking to some of these pioneers, and what I discovered, which I didn't expect, was that each of them had found another piece of a completely new view of the world. They were revolutionizing science and revolutionizing our view of who we really are. So my task was really to try to synthesize their work, because scientists, first of all, speak in math. They speak in code. And also, they don't like to speculate about how different things fit together. They like to just stay with their little experimental patch. So I put that all together, and it was very much about how we're much more connected than we thought we were via a giant quantum field. So it wasn't a human energy field. It was a big field that united us all. There were also aspects of their work that were kind of leftover business for me. The idea through a lot of their study and their experiments that thoughts are an actual thing with the capacity to change physical matter. So being the hard-nosed reporter that I am, I didn't really take this with anything other than a lot of awkward questions. I kept thinking to myself, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about just shifting a quantum particle, or are we talking about curing people of cancer? And also I was intrigued by an idea. What happens when lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? Does that magnify the effect? So I couldn't find much research about this. So I decided to compile what there was about intention into my next book, The Intention Experiment. But that was also an invitation, because I thought to myself, well, I've got a lot of readers now. The field was in 30 languages. And I also have a lot of contacts with the scientific community. I know a lot of these guys in consciousness research. So if I just put them together and I have the scientists set up proper studies, we'll have the biggest global laboratory in the world. So we did that. We set up an intention experiment. And every so often I would invite my readers to come onto my internet site or an audience if I was actually speaking somewhere. And I would have the scientists set up some controlled studies somewhere in their lab. And we're talking about University of Arizona or Penn State University, University of California, a lot of prestigious scientists. The scientists would set this experiment up. I'd invite my readers to take part. And then the scientists would calculate the results. So we started out small with seeds and leaves, just trying to make little properties, change little properties of them. We moved on to trying to purify water, to trying to lower violence in war-torn areas, to even trying to cure somebody of PTSD. Now, I was really far from convinced this was going to work. I thought, I don't know about any of this. So I wrote a lot of qualifiers in the intention experiment saying, it's important just to ask the question. It's okay if it doesn't work. But actually, it did work. It worked. It really worked. Of the 30 experiments we've run where we've calculated the results, 26 have shown measurable positive responses. Now, there is no pharmaceutical agent out there that has that kind of consistent track record. So there was some really amazing stuff with that. I discovered a lot about the power of the mind to travel vast distances to affect things. I mean, for instance, one of our first experiments was with trying to make seeds grow faster. This was one of our early experiments. Now, the first time I ran this, and we've run it 12 times, I was in Sydney, Australia, and I had an audience of about 700. And the seeds, meanwhile, were at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, about 8,000 miles away. So I had got 4 sets of photos of 4 sets of seeds, 30 seeds each from the scientists. We chose one of them randomly. I showed them the photo. We sent intention to those seeds. The scientists didn't know which one of the 4 we'd chosen. After I told them they were done, they planted the seeds, and 5 days later, they measured them. And as it turned out, at that point, I unblinded the study and said, yeah, it was seeds D or whatever it was. And what happened was the seed sent intention grew significantly higher than the controls. And every time we ran the study, the same thing happened. Now, let's just stop for a moment and think about this, because here I am in Sydney, Australia with my audience. We're sending intention to seeds that are 8,000 miles away. And we're not sending intention to the thing itself. We're sending intention to a photograph of the thing. So a symbolic representation of the thing. So that in itself would suggest some sort of amazing psychic internet. But I just want to say before we dive in further, this wasn't the most interesting part of the studies. They were cool, but what was much more interesting was what was happening to the participants. They were having mirror effects. They were having effects as big as, if not bigger than the targets. And also, when I scaled it down to groups of 8 in a workshop, extraordinary things happened too.
So here we arrive at the power of 8. And it makes it's very logical then how you ended up taking this point of the rebounding effect, the mirror effect that you're calling it, and taking your amazing sort of investigative journalist approach to assembling then another group of scientists to help you explain and navigate this story. And one of the reasons why it's so exciting for me is some of these people we've actually had as previous guests on this podcast, like Konstantin Krakow and Jeff Fannin, and some of the others that I hope to interview in the near future. But so let's pick up there and go a little bit deeper into the beginnings of the Power of 8, and that sort of chapter of this bigger epic.
Okay, so what happened about 2008? I'd run a number of these experiments from 2007. We were having results. And I thought to myself, well, I ought to probably have a workshop. That's what people in this kind of field do. But the trouble was, I was a journalist. I hadn't run workshops before. I'm not a personal development trainer. I wasn't really quite sure what I was going to do. So I'm sitting there one day talking to my husband, Brian, and I'm saying to him, I don't know, maybe I'll just put them in groups of 8 or something like that and have them send an intention to somebody in the group with a health challenge. And being a good headline writer, Brian turned to me and said, yeah, the power of 8. I love it. And so that's what we did. The first time we ran this was in Chicago in spring of 2008. I put people into groups. I told them how to do intention. And I knew that from studying intention masters, master healers, Buddhist monks, Qigong masters, and looking at what common practices they used and distilling the common ones into a simple program, as well as adding in some of the aspects of intention that had worked really well in the scientific lab. And I put that together to a simple program I call Powering Up. So I taught them all about powering up. But then I didn't know what to do about making a group effect, a small group effect. So I'm telling them, be in a circle, hold hands, do this, do that. I'm essentially making it up as I go along. And I'm assuming this is going to feel like having a facial. It's going to be a nice little feel-good exercise, nothing more. So the next day, I invite them back. I give a mic to all of the people who had been the recipient of the intention in their group, and I ask them to say how they felt. Again, assuming they're going to say, yeah, relax, like having a back massage, blah, blah, blah. That's not what they said. What they said was stuff like this. I've had terrible knee pain and arthritis in one leg for years, and I'm walking normally today. I've had a migraine every day of my life for years, and my head is clear. I have terrible IBS, and my gut feels normal today. I have awful insomnia. I slept like a baby last night, and on and on and on it went. I have cataracts, and I'm 80% better. So I was just shocked. So was my husband. We're looking at each other across the room thinking, what on earth is this? And I assumed that it was just a placebo effect. I dismissed it. And I didn't think much more about it until the next workshop. And I tried it again. And not only did it work the same way, but we had extraordinary healings. We had a woman with scoliosis who was in terrible pain. And not only did her pain disappear immediately, but her daughter wrote me a few months later to say that her back was so straight they had to change her rear view mirror of her car. We had a woman who was a stroke victim who couldn't focus her eyes. And right after her little intention, and we're talking about 10 minutes, she can see normally for the first time since the stroke. And on, people with terrible arthritis walking normally, people with multiple sclerosis coming in without their crutches, on and on and on it went. And the same thing was happening with the senders. We were having healing among the senders, which tended to nullify the whole idea of a placebo effect. Why were the senders getting healed too? So this freaked me out. And it's one reason it's taken me 10 years to publish this book. Because, as you say, the journo in me had to understand what on earth was going on here.
So when you went about addressing that question, where did your mind go first in terms of what was like question number one in that process, and who did you seek out for dialoguing about that?
Well, what also happened is this coincided with another thing that was going on. Around the same time, I ran a peace intention experiment around 2008, I think September 2008. And we sent intention to lower violence in Sri Lanka. It was an extraordinary situation. I had a team of scientists looking at the data afterward, including a professor of statistics at University of California. And she looked at weekly data of injuries and deaths from 2 years before our intention to several months afterward. Now, we chose Sri Lanka because there was a 25-year war going on there with no resolution in sight. Plus, they had a very good record-keeping system. And one of the problems you have with trying to do intention in a war-torn area, if you're trying to look at it scientifically, is needing a very accurate system of counting the bodies. And most people, certainly most governments, don't like to talk about the bodies. So we found this in Sri Lanka. We did our intention over 8 days, every day, 10 minutes for 8 days. And extraordinary things happened. First of all, violence quadrupled during the 8 days and then plummeted to well below. Now, I was pretty worried about it, looking at violence going up during our week, but then it plummeted. I kept thinking, did we do this? Whoops. Yeah. But then it plummeted to well below, and a more interesting thing happened. That very week of our intention, the government, Sri Lankan government, which had been losing the war, won a couple of important decisive battles that enabled it to recapture the north within a few months, and then within a few months after that, to end the war. Now, it ended in a bloody finish, but it ended. And that was extraordinary to me. It looked like from every week, our very week of intention, through the entire 25 years was probably pivotal, most pivotal of all in the course of ending the war. Did we do this? Short answer, who knows? There's a lot of variables in there, but it was certainly compelling. But again, not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story appeared when I decided to survey our participants just to see how they'd been getting on. And I wanted to find out if the internet system worked for them, because we'd had some problems in our early experiments with that. Too many people coming on our website at the same moment. So, and I happened to ask them some other questions. How was that for you? And I got back things like, I felt like I was part of a higher network. I was crying uncontrollably. I had tingling and electricity up and down my arms. I felt like I was in the tractor beam of Star Trek, and on and on and on, thousands of these, because we had 15,000 participants. And so I was blown away by this. People were describing essentially a mystical experience. And it also had other elements in it, in that it had changed them afterward. They talked about it becoming more peaceful. Many people wrote about how they had made up with estranged people in their lives, estranged relatives. They were getting along better with their coworkers. They were getting along better with their not so nice boss. They were in love. 40% or more, I think, said that they were in love with everyone they came into contact with. I mean, these people were hugging strangers. I was completely freaked out by this at this point. So I'm starting to formulate this idea of there's some sort of mirror effect going on here. When people intend for something like peace, their lives become more peaceful. And that certainly, we saw the same thing when we were trying to heal a Gulf War veteran of PTSD. Again, the people setting intention, they were getting healings. We had long lists of, my knee has never worked very well. It's completely gone. My own panic attacks are gone. I have bad Crohn's disease, not anymore. And, on and on and on, the same weird thing. So it started to occurring to me that I had to really look at this whole concept of group intention, group prayer, if you will, as a kind of rebound effect. Whether the groups were large or the groups were small, there was some extraordinary healing mechanism going on. So probably the first place I started was really trying to look at, if there was an antecedent for this. Somebody had to have thought of this before me. And the weird thing was I consulted a lot of people who were experts in prayer, healing, esoteric religions, religions themselves and healing practices, and no one had ever heard of the rebound effects. I checked with a number of authorities I figured, well, there had to have been prayer circles. There were plenty of prayer circles, but not this kind of rebound effect of healing that I was finding with the 8. So that was probably the first place I was starting to look.
Did you ever get to a full explanation of the mechanism behind this, or simply that this thing is real and it works, and here's how you do it?
A little of both. I mean, there were lots of things going on. First of all, I then moved on to brainwaves, looking at brainwave signatures. Now, what I decided to do, I was very lucky in that in 2015, I spoke in front of Life University, the largest chiropractic university in the world. And they have a big neuroscience and psychology department. And the head there was intrigued by my Power of 8 groups and said he would put the neuroscience departments at my disposal and psychology departments to run a series of studies. So this was just wonderful. So the first study we did and we completed was putting student volunteers into groups, Power of 8 groups, and monitoring one of the senders, looking at their brainwaves while they were sending intention. And I figured it would look like the brainwave signatures for people doing meditation. It didn't at all. It didn't look like them at all when we ran it 7 times, I think. What happened is very soon after they got into these little Power of 8 groups, there was a global quieting in the parts of the brain involved with distinguishing self from not self. The parietal lobes of the brain, which are sort of in the back of the head, to the rear of the head, behind the ears, and certain other parts of the brain involved with saying, this is the world and this is me, and we're separate. So there was a real quieting of a sense of separation. There was also a quieting of the parts of the brain involved in worry, doubt, negativity, the certain parts of the frontal lobes. So these were brainwave signatures of people who were in a state of ecstatic oneness. And also they were identical to the brainwave signatures as recorded by Dr. Andrew Newberg of the University of Pennsylvania, who studied Sufi masters in the middle of chanting and Buddhist monks in the middle of ecstatic prayer. Our people were in a mystical state of oneness. That was essentially what was going on. So I look at that as one aspect of it. But of course, the real interesting piece of that is usually it takes years of disciplined practice to get into that kind of state. To become a Sufi master is no mean feat, or it takes hours of priming to get yourself into that state. Our people were total novices, most of whom had never even meditated before, and all they had was a 13-minute video from me telling them how to run the groups. Nevertheless, they were transported into this mystical state in an instant. And remember, these Power of 8 groups were holding the group intention together for just 10 minutes.
Wow. So
that really convinced me and demonstrated to me that this was a fast track to the miraculous, essentially.
And this, I'm assuming, is your Powering Up program.
No. Oh, you mean what I was telling them how to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was telling them how to do the Powering Up program, and I was also explaining how to do this in a group. Because Powering Up can be done individually or in a group. So the brainwave stuff is one piece of it, though, just one piece of it. Another there is group effects. There are, the French psychologist, Emile Durkheim used to talk about groups having a collective effervescence. So there's a group effect, but another big, and of course there's the power of intention, but a big piece here is the power of altruism. Something that never gets discussed in this self-help movement. Just the title, self-help, all about me. But in most of these instances, people are intending for someone else in the group or someone outside the group. And when you start looking at the literature on altruism, it makes total sense because Altruism is like a bulletproof vest. Um, all of the studies demonstrate that if you do something for someone else, no matter how minor, you live longer, you live healthier, and you are happier in every regard. And also, there's big things that go on with your immune system. When you're compassionate towards someone else, you fire a thing called the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in your body. It winds from your neck down through all of the major organs of your body. And it's involved in the release of things like oxytocin, the love hormone, that gets released when we're caring for a child or something like that. But it also has a very positive effect on the immune system, according to studies from the University of California at Berkeley. It's kind of like a virtuous circle with your immune system. It keeps making you healthier and happier.
The definition you gave, I was watching an interview, you gave a very simple definition for altruism, something like just simply intending good for others. And I think it's a word that kind of has been mired in the past, and it's almost it's not hip anymore to use this word. We're using other words that are a little more mechanical to explain it. But can you explain that, unpack that a little bit more for us?
Sure, and I can do it best by giving you an example. I run a master class every year, an intention master class, and I decided to study 1 year and invite people. This was the first year I ran it for an entire year. I invited, it was about 250 people who took part. And I didn't really tell them what was going to go on. I just said, look, you're going to be part of this intention masterclass. I'll teach you how to do intention, and then I'm going to put you in groups, and we'll monitor you for a year. What I didn't tell them was that they were my little petri dish, and I was going to study them. And so I put them into groups, and I monitored them month by month by month to see what happened. And I looked at their health, their finances and career, their relationships, their life purpose, as did they. And so we, month by month by month, they recorded that. And what happened was the people who stayed together meeting every week, and that was about 150 of them, pretty much 100% of them had major, major life changes using these Power of Eight, just being in a Power of Eight group and intending in the group. I'm talking about curing lifelong depression. Another woman had 15 years worth of chronic fatigue, could hardly walk for 5 minutes, and she's now hiking and lifting weights. Repigmenting vitiligo, plus financial windfalls of all kinds, just when they needed them for just the right amount. People getting dream jobs just when they needed them. And people making up with estranged relatives once again, and relationships occurring, and all kinds of great things in relationship front. So something on that front, people deciding to do something new with their lives, completely new, that's much more fulfilling, and having it work out. All of those things happened. But one or two, as the journey was going through the year, and we were going through that year, few people weren't getting anywhere. So one of them was Andy. Now, Andy needed a new job. She had sold her gift store business. She was getting a divorce. She had small children. So she needed work. And she was very good in marketing, very hireable, but just couldn't get a job. So we tried all kinds of things. The group was trying all kinds of things for nothing. She was getting no leads. Nothing was happening for her. Bright young woman, too. So finally, in a kind of fit of frustration, I just said to her, Andy, just get off of yourself. Start intending for someone else. And the someone else I had in mind was a young man called Luke. Now, Luke had been written, his stepfather wrote to me. Luke was 15, had just broken up with his first serious girlfriend, and in a fit of adolescent angst, threw himself off a 40-foot structure onto hard ground. Now, he broke every bone in his body. He had nerve damage. He had brain damage. The doctors were they were unconvinced he was going to live. So we set up a healing vigil for Luke of three weeks. We did it 3 separate weekends where we intended just for 10 minutes as usual. While his stepfather, who knew when we were doing the intentions, kept a running commentary of what was happening to him before, during, and after the intention. So we had a really very, very clear and complete documented record of any changes he might have had, whether they were at the time of our intentions. And sure enough, in most of the times we were doing intention, Luke had major changes. He rediscovered his will to live. He had been really poorly before and he was so much better afterward, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Luke got out of the hospital in record time. He's healed. He's done really well. Now, that could have been good doctoring, or it could have been our intention, or both. But I know it wasn't placebo, by the way, because Luke, unlike his parents, but like most adolescents, thought the power of intention was pretty stupid. So he wasn't a placebo effect. But here's what happened to Andy, which was even more interesting. The moment Andy got off of herself and started intending for Luke, she gets a call out of nowhere the next week from someone she doesn't know offering her a dream job. And that happened over and over and over again. Instead of intending for themselves, when people started intending for someone else, amazing things happened in their lives and their intentions actually came true.
You mentioned earlier around altruism that there are significant health benefits documented health benefits from practicing altruism or intending for someone else in a good way. And I wonder if you could extend that conversation into community at large and longevity as it exists, because one of the conversations happening in the sort of longevity anti-aging movement are the blue zones and what exactly is happening in these areas. And I wonder how much of a role you think that this is playing.
Oh, community is everything. And I'll demonstrate that with a really great study I had in my book before this called The Bond. Some American epidemiologists were fascinated by the Japanese because they smoke like chimneys, but they don't get heart disease until some of them come to the US, and then some do and some don't. So these epidemiologists, I think they were from Berkeley, decided to really study this further. So they started looking at these clusters of Japanese who had come to America, and they found that diet had nothing to do with whether or not they got heart disease. Didn't matter whether they had sushi, and wasabi or Big Macs and fries. Diet had nothing to do with it. What had everything to do with it was whether or not they had recreated the close community ties they'd had like in the old country. And when they went to Japan to study this further, this X factor of impregnable good health, the Japanese looked at them and said, well, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Why? You Americans, you're so lonely. You even walk down the street alone. Everybody can see this. And for them, the whole idea of being so alone was the real disease. And, I've just looked at some new evidence on blue zones, and it appears that the community part is the biggest and most important piece.
Can you tell us about the results of your October American Peace Experiment?
We're just collating the results. Yes, we ran that in October. We're just collating the results. Well, we're still looking at it, but it's looking very positive. And the other thing I can tell you about is, and it's looking positive for lowering violence. And once again, we had situations where a lot of people had that rebound effect in their own lives. We did an intention for St. Louis, Missouri, which is St. Louis, Missouri, which is officially the most violent place in America. And we even focused on the most violent street in all of America. So we're looking at some of the data now. My scientists are analyzing it. We ran another experiment about a month later that was really interesting called the Middle Eastern Intention Experiment. Now, I was part of a Middle Eastern summit that was run from a studio in southern England. And what happened was, this is special technology where they have cameras that it went to. It has the ability to go to 9 different locations. So we had cameras in 9 different conference rooms, well, 8 different conference rooms in different countries in the Arab Gulf states. So we had participants from Saudi Arabia in one location, and Oman in another location, and and Kuwait and so forth. Our 9th screen was focused on an auditorium filled with Israelis in Jerusalem. So we had people from 9 different locations, and I could see all of them. There were 9 separate screens, and they could see me, and I could speak to any one of the 9, and they could speak to me. And they could speak to each other. So we did an intention to lower violence in an area of Jerusalem that's had high violence in the old city, the Damascus Gate area. So we sent intention there, and here's such an interesting thing that happened. Because the 9 screens can talk to each other afterward, the Arabs started sending love to the Jews. The Jews started saying, "My God is your God," to the Arabs. It was incredible. It was historic. I mean, and as some of the Arabs explained to us afterward, they'd never actually seen a Jew. They'd seen maybe some photographs, but they were told by the authorities that essentially the Jews have horns coming out of their heads. So for them, it was just a wonderful revelation of connection. They were talking about sisters and brothers. I mean, it made a lot of the Middle Eastern press. It was really quite amazing. That's another thing that I found happened, because that happened in an earlier experiment of mine too, where I invited Muslims and Americans to be part of an intention on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 to send intention to 2 southern provinces in Afghanistan. Once again, the outcome was very compelling. Lowering of violence, looked like we might have done something, who knows, very complicated, lots of variables. But the more interesting thing is what happened between the Muslims and the Americans. They started writing to each other on my Facebook page and my instant messenger page, and they started befriending each other and ultimately started forgiving each other for 9/11. So that's all part of that vagus nerve activity. When you do something compassionate, it also fires up things in your body, making you more tolerant of the other. So I think we were seeing this in action in both those experiments.
What's next for you? Where are we going next? I'm sure that more questions have arisen out of the writing of this text and your recent work.
Okay, so smaller and informal experiments or joining in. I'm probably going to do something I want my audience to be part of the Parkland March on March 24th. I do live Facebook events, and we have people just intending informally for some things. We're doing more studies. Now we want to look at immune system markers with our Power of 8 groups. I'm running a big masterclass this year. I've got 700 and something people on the course, and I'm watching these people and what's the miracles that are unfolding. I'm running a retreat in Tuscany in September, October, where I'll be working very intensely with people, but we'll also be visiting Florence and Assisi and the Chianti Trail and San Gimignano, et cetera, which will be wonderful. So lots of things going on, and also more work with the Bond, which is really about how to, really tools for a new world, essentially.
Just one final question here is around the size of the group. So your intention experiments were massive and global in scale, and it seemed like you kept scaling them down to what could happen on a community level, that could happen with just kind of lay folks that want to actually start something up. And was 8 this magic number that everything started clicking, or was there a range? And was there was there an amplitude of change that you saw occur with different sizes? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. 8 was a total accident. I just said, hey, what if I put them in groups of 8? Now, I wasn't thinking of sacred geometry or the fact lots of people have sent me all kinds of things about 8. Of course, 8 is infinity sideways. But it wasn't like that. It was just an accident. I think of 8 as a Goldilocks figure, not too small, not too big. It's a really nice figure. But groups of 7 and groups of 9 work too. I would tend to say that it needs to be 5 or more and 12 or less. Otherwise, it's too small or it gets too large and too unwieldy. So the point is a group. And also, it doesn't matter. The more doesn't equal better. When we ran the seed experiment, remember I told you we did it 12 times, different locations, also on the internet. And we do that also to replicate, to make sure that, what we've seen really is true. And if you can replicate things over and over again in science, it tends to demonstrate that you've had a really positive effect and not just a fluke. But what we found is that the effects were just as powerful whether we had 100 people attending or whether we had thousands over the internet. It just didn't matter.
Well, Lynne, before we sign off, please give the listeners your online information, how they can get a hold of you, sign up for events and whatnot, and get your books.
Okay, great. Thank you. My books are in all bookstores and on Amazon or any other online booksellers. You can come find out more about me on lynnmctaggart.com. We have a forum page on our website, lynnmctaggart.com/forum. If you want to set up a Power of 8 group, there we've got hundreds of groups that are already formed in different time zones. So you can join one of their groups, or you can post information about how you're setting up a group in your particular time zone and have other people join. And one of the things that we found is you don't have to be in the same room as these people. Remember, all of those amazing effects we've had in our master classes that we've documented are with groups of people who meet every week on Skype. Many of our master class people have been attending with each other for years, and they've never physically met each other. It's only on Skype. So distance doesn't matter. I've even put people in groups on telephone teleseminars, and we've had amazing, amazing effects.
Wow. Well, thank you again, Lynne, and good luck with everything. If you'd like to join Lynne's peace experiment on March 24th, you can find that on her Facebook page, which is Lynne McTaggart 2011.